I often find it interesting to talk to folks in insurance because so many just sort of wandered their way in, right? By contrast, I jumped in with both feet. So I spent a long time at the Wall Street Journal writing about technology, became a partner in a consulting firm that pioneered the idea of digital strategy back in the early 90s, and then wrote a number of books on innovation, largely dealing with digital disruption. And then about 10 years ago, sort of took stock of the situation and decided that there were really 4 areas that had yet to be turned upside down by digital technology: government, higher education, healthcare, and insurance. I met a guy who had started Insurance Thought Leadership, which was it's an online platform where we have people share the best ideas they can come up with for innovation in insurance, find a way to get people talking to each other some, broadcast the ideas as much as we can through social media and so forth. And I thought, okay, this is a place I want to participate. I go back far enough that I met a lot of the folks in the early days of the personal computer industry, the Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Mitch Kapoors and so forth of the world. And there was a messianic fervor that I really liked about those folks at the time, summarized best by the famous Steve Jobs line about wanting to put a dent in the universe. And I thought, okay, insurance is this huge industry, wildly important, is thinking about innovating in a fundamental way for the first time in a long time. This is a place where I could maybe put a dent in the universe. So I very much appreciate the invitation from Insurance Europe, Michaela, and the rest of her team to come here and talk to you folks, because I think you are the folks who are putting a dent in the universe, who are going to put a dent in the universe, and who will inspire the next generation and the next generation after that to do the same. I'm acutely aware that Don, in the last panel, not only started the clock on himself, but on me, talking about narrowing the gap between this session and the reception. So I'll be fairly quick. I really just want to communicate one idea that I hope will provoke you and make you think as you walk out of the room, as you get back to the office tomorrow, or as you get back to the office on Monday, if like me, you're going to take advantage of this spectacular city and stick around for another couple of days. And that idea is based on one of the most remarkable folks I've had the pleasure of meeting, a fellow named Alan Kay. He says that the best way to predict the future is to invent it. So you talk about unknown unknowns, known unknowns, and so forth. This is the way I think about organizing what is possible out there into a way that is manageable for the future. So when I say Alan is remarkable, he has invented the future a number of times. He was the leader of the group back at Xerox PARC that invented the personal computer. He personally came up with the notion of overlapping screens that's on all our computers. He invented something called object-oriented programming, which is why you have so many apps so easily on your smartphones. And he then went on to become sort of the Steve Jobs whisperer. So he's the one who took Jobs on a tour of Xerox PARC and got him excited about the technology, which led to the Macintosh. He stuck around and advised Jobs. He actually did a video of something called the Knowledge Navigator that was the iPad 20 years before the iPad came out. If you look at the video and look at the iPad, they're really just remarkably similar, and that was the vision that guided the Apple Labs all through that. The iPhone basically fell out of the work on the iPad, so Alan had a big impact on that. For good measure, he's the one who convinced Steve Jobs to buy Pixar. I actually met Alan back in 1986 because I saw him do a demo of Pixar and thought, that's the coolest thing I've ever seen. I've got to meet this guy. So Alan's idea is the best way to predict the future is to invent it. To help you think about that a little bit, I have 2 things I'll go through here. One is a way of thinking about digital disruption that I hope will widen the aperture a little bit for you and help you maybe think about ways that insurance can more flexibly attack the protection gap and some of the other issues we've heard people talk about today. And then the other is the best tool I've come across for organizing thoughts in a way that will take advantage of what you've heard here already, what I'm going to say, what you know, what your organizations know, and then organize your thoughts in a way that you can act on. So the first is this model of how you think about what digitization looks like and what disruption looks like. And it basically looks like this being the camera in my phone. If you go back, it took centuries for photography really to develop. You know, you go back, and of course, Leonardo had a hand in it with camera obscura that he worked on. Then a couple French chemists came along in the early 1800s and really started to develop the chemistry of what we think of as photography. Things really got cooking, literally, in the 1860s, 1870s, when a fellow named George Eastman came along and actually started using his mother's stove to cook and test various films and so forth. Eventually came up with film that you could use on a spool and started selling smaller and smaller cameras. A revolutionary camera called the Brownie came out in the early 1900s. And things sort of progressed from there. You had Polaroids with Edwin Land, you had color film, you had smaller and smaller cameras and so forth, but it was all still physical, right? It was all still analog. There was some work that was starting to be done on digital photography, partly because it turns out that to record a TV show, you have to have some digital capability. So back with the I Love Lucy stuff in the US and different shows, I'm sure, around the world, you had to have some capability digitally to record. So they figured some of that out, and then in the 1970s, Kodak actually invented the digital sensor for a camera and pretty much decided to bury it because it wasn't their business model. But in any case, you started to have these capabilities really available. And then Philippe Kahn had a baby. Philippe Kahn is a really interesting fellow who I got to know because he had a PC software business in the early days, a French mathematician who moved to the US. And in 1997, his wife was having a baby. Well, Philippe had a digital camera at that point and was thinking, it's really kind of stupid that I'm going to take photographs here in the hospital, then I'm going to go home and I'm going to upload everything from the card into my computer and I'm going to email photos to people. Why can't I just do it from my phone? It's digital. It has connections wirelessly. And his poor wife went through a long labor. So Philippe wound up having a lot of time in the Santa Cruz hospital. And by the time she had the baby, he had his phone wired so that he sent the first photograph from a phone from the hospital in Santa Cruz in 1997. And that changed everything. It took maybe 10 years or so for it to change everything because there were still some things about cameras and so forth, and that took a while to develop, and printers and so forth. But it got to the point where it now costs about $2 to put a camera in a phone. Right, you don't need the $1,000 digital cameras, you don't need anything else, you just have it in the phone. And you no longer need the chemicals and the paper and the film and all these other things that went into an analog camera. So complete game changer. Well, when people think about that, they tend to focus on the fact that Kodak screwed up, right? Kodak had lots of warning. They invented the digital sensor, and they blew it. But in fact, if you look at it, it's not like that value just disappeared. Yes, it was a disaster for Kodak and its shareholders. Yes, it was a disaster for Rochester, New York, where Kodak had been based for a long time. But think about the other companies that took advantage of the fact that you can now have these digital photographs, right? Facebook wouldn't exist without that capability because you can share all sorts of things that you wouldn't have been able to otherwise. Instagram, TikTok, Pinterest, all these other things. In some cases, companies worth hundreds of billions of dollars because the value basically moved from Kodak to these other businesses once you got rid of the physical manifestations. And in my experience, that's what digitization looks like. That's what disruption really looks like. I tell people I've been watching the same movie for 36 years now, because I started covering IBM for the Wall Street Journal back in 1986, and basically saw IBM blow up. At the time I started covering the company, the rule of thumb was that IBM was half the revenue in the computer industry, the entire industry, 2/3 of the profit and 3/4 of the market value. And IBM just didn't understand how the pace of the industry of changing, the metabolism of the industry was changing, and they fell by the wayside. Then digital disruption hit the rest of the computer industry. And then the internet, commercial internet came along, and commerce and everything else was starting to be turned upside down. And then books and you name it, just everything was changing. And I think you can see that play out in the insurance industry. If you take that sort of model, that you strip something down to its essence in the way that photography stripped the image down to its essence. You just have an image, you have a way to share it. In insurance, there really are three things. One is the customer/contract. The second is a yes-no adjudication mechanism. Do you pay, do you not pay? And the third is capital. And once the industry really becomes digital, those three things can take basically any form. They don't have to take the form that they've taken to this point. I'm a believer in agents, but you don't necessarily have to have agents anymore, at least not the way you do now. Contract language, I believe in standardization there, but you're going to, I think, see some of the sort of hybrids that you see, say, with Lemonade, where they give you the layman's explanation and then give you the longer explanation beneath it. But anyway, that all becomes freeform. People talk a lot about embedded insurance these days, because if you're buying a car, why don't you buy the insurance? If you're buying a house, why don't you buy the insurance? So there are all sorts of things that can change, even though we think of things as being done a certain way. With the yes-no mechanism, you have parametric insurance that's starting to happen a lot these days. But you can also have other sorts of triage mechanisms. So you have a natural disaster, and you triage and you decide that, okay, Michaela's reliable, Paul's not. So she gets her claim paid right away, I don't. Or you decide that there's some amount that most people are probably okay for. So you pay 20% or something. You give people cash right away. There are just all kinds of things that can happen in that yes-no mechanism that couldn't happen before. With the capital, you have insurance-linked securities, whatever. You have money that can come in through bonds, through capital markets, or whatever, that doesn't necessarily have to come in through the reinsurers and the insurers, even though that's the way everything has been done for decades, centuries, whatever. So as you think about the protection gap, as you think about the industry in general, I would encourage you to think about it stripped down to those three elements and not be constrained by traditional divisions, right? I mean, I have all kinds of health insurance from my auto policy, from my employer. Before too long, I'll be eligible for Medicare in the U.S. There are workers' comp, all these sorts of things. And they're all treated separately, and there certainly are historical reasons for that. But they don't have to always be treated separately. There can be a policy of Paul. And life insurance, I think, will merge more with wealth management. And there are all sorts of things that can change, and I would encourage you to have an open mind as you think about that. There are some risks that can happen because other people can take advantage of those changes and attack the current structure where it's inefficient. But there also are opportunities, as you think in particular about the protection gap, to take advantage of that. So now the tool. My nickname around the Wall Street Journal was Dr. Death. The reason is that I had started to cover IBM when it was the dominant company in the world, and it had a near-death experience by the time I stopped covering the company and wrote a book about its problems in 1993. So then I went to Mexico and ran the bureau there for the Wall Street Journal for 2.5 years. The country at that point was the darling of the developing world, and within 4 months after I got there, there was a rebellion. A month later, the fellow who would have been the president of Mexico after Salinas was assassinated, the first assassination in many decades. By the end of 1994, there was a devaluation that not only derailed Mexico, but pretty much all of Latin America's economies and threatened the US economy there for a while. So actually, when I came back to the US, briefly in the San Francisco bureau, someone I knew who was the chief spokesman at Intel called me and said, "I will pay you money not to cover my company." In fact, I did cover his company, and the chip industry went into a 2-year recession. So more than most people, my point being that I was accustomed to writing about failures. And it occurred to me that in the early 2000s, as Jim Collins was writing all his great books about success stories, that nobody had ever looked at failures. So a colleague and I got our old consulting firm to lend us 20 researchers for 2 years, and we looked at 2,500 failures. The working title was Good to Gone, or Built to Bust, I guess was the other one. And in the way that Jim Collins said, here's how to be like those success stories, we said, here are the patterns of failure, here's how not to be like those guys. What we learned was that in 47% of the failures we looked at, the failure of the strategy should have been perfectly obvious. A lot of these failures were things like a British cement company, the 5th biggest cement company in the world, deciding that it wasn't really a cement company, it was a home products company. So it started making lawnmowers and other things like home furnaces, and pretty quickly went bankrupt. So we thought, okay, what do you do to try to head off these sorts of failures? And the tool we came up with is what we call a future history. You may not have heard that term because that's sort of Chunka's and my term, but you may have heard of red team, blue team exercises, or what some people call a pre-mortem. The idea is that you, with a future history, you pick a date sometime in the future, and then you put yourself in that moment and you write a history of it. So you decide you want to narrow the protection gap in your particular area of it, and you say, okay, let's say that needs to be a 10-year vision. So you say, all right, we're in June 2nd, 2032, and we succeeded. What did that look like? What is the sequence of events that got us there? And it takes a fair amount of work. You can do this sort of thing yourself, and I would encourage you to think about that when you get back to the office. It's more productive typically if you do this sort of thing with colleagues. You have a half day or even a full day strategy session with your teams, and you say, okay, if we are going to do X to narrow the protection gap by 2032, what are the things that have to happen? Things you can do, things maybe other companies in the ecosystem could do, things that might have to happen in terms of inventions, carbon sequestration, that sort of thing. And then once you have all those ideas together, you pull them together into this story. I do them as Wall Street Journal stories just because I have a little familiarity with what that looks like. But the point is really just to have a story, because it connects all the dots and it lets everybody sort of see how the flow of events ought to happen. It also tends to point out problems, because if you're just sort of saying something magic has to happen, then it's pretty clear from the story that that's not going to work. So we've done a lot of these, and I assure you that they work. We actually did some work about 10 years ago with one of the largest insurance companies in the US, where the CEO wanted to foster a culture of innovation. We laid out this sort of progression for this company, and he actually liked it enough that every year for the next 5 years, because it was a 5-year exercise, he pulled it out at his annual leadership meeting and sort of let people know where they were on the continuum and encouraged people because they were making that sort of progress. You also see problems. We did some consulting with one of the biggest automakers in the US on its autonomous vehicle strategy. And they could see as they looked at the story that they were being wildly optimistic about how quickly ride-sharing, taxi services, Uber-like services would become possible for driverless cars. And it wasn't just because of what we did, but we contributed to a change in thinking at the company that had them delay their entry into the driverless car robo-taxi market by about 3 years. So I would encourage you to think about this sort of thing. You can do scenario planning as part of it, right? If you want to test out what happens if the Russian invasion in Ukraine lasts longer, if another pandemic happens quickly, if this one mutates again and goes on for much longer than people had expected and so forth. There are all sorts of things you can crank into this, but the main thing is to get people thinking and then craft all that into a narrative so that people can take a look at it and sort of see how they might buy into the story. It's less fun, but I would also encourage you to do the flip side. So you project out 10 years and it didn't work. Well, what did that look like? What went wrong? Again, you craft a story so that you can sort of see where the pitfalls happened, and you can figure out how to potentially avoid those things. So that's really all. I would just encourage you to think about the digital disruption and think about insurance as a contract customer, a yes-no mechanism, money. And then think about how you would organize your thoughts into this future history so that you can see where the opportunities are and also see where the pitfalls are. I realize that this is all a little abstract, so I would like to point you to a couple things where if you are, in fact, provoked enough to follow up on this idea of a future history, you can see what one would look like. So I actually brought a couple copies of a book that my buddy Chunka and I published with another person last fall, and if anybody wants one, just see me. I only have 2, but it goes into, in some detail, the concept of a future history and actually has a number of examples, including an extended one on climate change, because climate change was a major reason that Chunka and I decided to write this book, which is called A Brief History of a Perfect Future, Inventing the World We Can Proudly Leave Our Kids by 2050. If you don't want to lug home a book, there is a website called perfectfuturebook.com that has extended excerpts from the book and that has examples of future histories so you could see what one would look like. Or if you want to chase me down on LinkedIn, which is not terribly hard these days, I've actually written a future history of the insurance industry. Did it about 15 months or so ago, so it's a little dated. And I'd be happy to share that with anybody so you can see at least what my vision of the insurance industry looks like. So I'm actually ending a few minutes early, so I'm delivering on my promise to get you to the reception. And I hope you have, in fact, been provoked. I hope you will go off and invent the future. And I hope we can all put a dent in the universe. So thank you all very much.